Join me as we explore how Peter, overwhelmed by awe and fear, learns to manage his emotions in the presence of such greatness. Discover how he finds the strength to overcome his fear and embrace the moment. Let's dive into the story.
It had been a long, exhausting journey for Jesus and his disciples, filled with teaching, healing, and growing tension with religious leaders. But on this particular day, something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would forever change the way a few of his closest disciples saw him. As the sun began to set, Jesus called Peter, James, and John, asking them to follow him up a high mountain. The three disciples, though unsure of the reason for this climb, obeyed without hesitation. The mountain path was steep, the air cooler the higher they ascended, and each step seemed to pull them further away from the crowds below. Peter, always eager, walked closely behind Jesus, while James and John quietly followed, wondering what awaited them at the top. When they finally reached the summit, the world below seemed distant. The view stretched for miles, but Jesus did not stop to admire it. Instead, he moved a short distance away and began to pray as he often did. The disciples, tired from the climb and the long day, sat down to rest. They watched their master, his figure bathed in the dim light of the fading sun. But as they gazed, something astonishing began to happen. Jesus' appearance started to change. His face, once illuminated by the gentle evening light, began to shine like the sun itself, so bright that the disciples had to shield their eyes. His clothes, which had been the simple garb of a wandering rabbi, transformed, glowing with a dazzling white light that radiated purity and power. It was as if heaven had touched earth at that very moment. The disciples, stunned and awestruck, could barely comprehend what they were seeing. As they squinted through the brilliance, they saw two other figures standing with Jesus. They were instantly recognizable, not because the disciples had ever seen them before, but because their presence was unmistakable. It was Moses, the great lawgiver of Israel, and Elijah, the prophet of fire who had been taken to heaven without experiencing death. The two men were speaking with Jesus, their conversation filled with the weight of eternity. They spoke about his forthcoming journey to Jerusalem and his death, a plan laid out long ago but soon to be fulfilled. Peter, overcome by the moment and ever impulsive, blurted out, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." It was a strange offer, reflecting Peter's desire to hold on to the moment, to capture the glory he was witnessing. He wanted to build tabernacles, places of worship and dwelling, as if to preserve this encounter with divine majesty. But Peter did not fully understand the magnitude of what was happening, nor did he realize that the glory of the moment was fleeting by design. Before Peter could finish his suggestion, something even more overwhelming occurred. A bright cloud, shining with the glory of God, descended over them, enveloping Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. The disciples were instantly filled with awe and terror. From the cloud came a voice, clear and majestic, unlike any human voice they had ever heard. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." The words pierced their hearts. This was not just a prophet or a teacher standing before them. It was God's own Son, beloved and chosen. The command to listen to him echoed in their minds, a divine mandate that made it clear that Jesus' authority surpassed that of even Moses and Elijah. The disciples were no longer just followers of a rabbi. They were in the presence of God's appointed Messiah, the fulfillment of all the promises made throughout Israel's history. Overwhelmed by the sheer holiness of the moment, Peter, James, and John fell to the ground, trembling with fear. They did not dare to look up, their faces pressed into the dirt. The radiance of God's glory was too much for them to bear, and their fear was a natural response to being in the presence of something so utterly otherworldly. But then, just as suddenly as the cloud had descended, it lifted. The booming voice was gone, and the brilliant light faded. A gentle hand touched them, and they heard the familiar, comforting voice of Jesus saying, "Get up, don't be afraid." Slowly, they raised their heads. The dazzling vision was gone. Moses and Elijah had disappeared, and only Jesus stood before them, his appearance returned to normal. The moment of transfiguration was over, but the impact lingered in their hearts. What they had just witnessed had changed everything. As they began their descent down the mountain, the atmosphere was filled with a solemn, reflective silence. The disciples were still trying to process what they had seen and heard. But before they could even begin to ask questions, Jesus spoke again, this time with an unexpected instruction. "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead," he said quietly. The disciples were puzzled. What did he mean by being raised from the dead? They had seen his glory and heard the voice of God affirming him as the Messiah, but the notion of his death and resurrection was still beyond their comprehension. Nevertheless, they obeyed, keeping the incredible vision to themselves. As they descended, the disciples could not help but think of the prophecy about Elijah's return. They asked Jesus, "Why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus responded, explaining that Elijah had already come, though not in the way they had expected. He was referring to John the Baptist, who had come in the spirit and power of Elijah, preparing the way for the Messiah. Yet, just as John had been rejected and killed, so too would the Son of Man suffer at the hands of men. The disciples began to understand, albeit dimly, that the glory they had witnessed on the mountain was intertwined with the suffering and sacrifice that awaited their Lord. By the time they reached the base of the mountain, the disciples were back in the midst of the bustling crowd. The awe of the mountaintop experience was quickly replaced by the demands of the people. A man approached Jesus, his face etched with desperation. His son was suffering from violent seizures, and none of the other disciples had been able to heal him. Jesus, with a deep sigh, rebuked the demon tormenting the boy and healed him instantly. It was a reminder to the disciples that the work of the kingdom was not just about glory, but about service, sacrifice, and compassion for those in need. As the days went on, Peter, James, and John carried the memory of the transfiguration in their hearts. They had seen Jesus as he truly was, the radiant, glorified Son of God, shining with the light of heaven. They had heard the voice of the Almighty, confirming his love for his Son and his command to listen to him. And though they did not fully understand everything at the time, they knew that they had witnessed something beyond earthly comprehension, something that pointed to the ultimate revelation of God's plan for salvation. The road ahead would lead to Jerusalem, to suffering, and to the cross. But beyond that, they now knew, lay resurrection, glory, and the fulfillment of God's promises. The Transfiguration was a glimpse of that future glory, a divine encounter that would sustain them through the trials and challenges yet to come. And in the end, when the time was right, they would tell the world what they had seen and heard on that mountaintop, the story of the transfigured Christ, the Son of God, who came to redeem all mankind.